Hello, everyone. This is the first lecture in the Philosophy 100 series of lectures, and we're going to start off today by discussing the nature of philosophy, what is philosophy, and sort of just thinking about what it means to have philosophy be kind of the most comprehensive subject matter available. So what is philosophy? Philosophy comes from the word philosophia, which in the Latin means the love of wisdom. Originally, philosophy used to be basically all of what we now think of as natural science. In a sense, basically, philosophy was just the broad study of everything that could be studied. Back in ancient Greek times, there was this sort of distinction that made its way into the intellectual sphere between things that were sort of serious philosophy and things that were less serious, like mythology, mythos, that had something to do with, both attempted to explain certain things, right? So mythology tends to try and explain where people come from or what's going on with the gods or whatnot, whereas philosophy tries to explain in a more causal or, like in what we contemporarily think of as an explanatory fashion, along the lines of science. As things sort of developed, empirical science developed out of philosophy. And now, empirical science has become this thing that we think of as, where all of our knowledge consists, right? Where all of our knowledge is. We have these repositories, right, of scientific theorizing and knowledge. And that seems right now. And basically, philosophy itself has, in a way, separated from science or become a different kind of thing. So science, is an interesting endeavor in and of itself that, most serious people, academics, are endeavoring towards, but science itself can't actually answer and doesn't even ask all of the possible kinds of questions that we might think we need to take seriously, that we might think deserve something along the lines of a serious answer. So there are still these big questions that we don't know the answers to. Things like, what happens after life, whether or not there's heaven or hell, is there a God, and what is he or she like? Things like, what's the right way to live? Is there a right or a wrong way to be in the world? What are you and I, right? Or am I some kind of soul? Or is there something more to me just as this animal creature with this brain? Does the soul continue on after death? Religious questions, whether or not certain religions are correct or incorrect. How we know any of these things at all, right? So most of this is the kind of stuff that science ultimately can't actually answer, at least not currently. And many of these questions in general seem as though they ought to be, at least attempted in a sense to be answered. But if we can't using science, then what are we going to do? Well, philosophy is still in this business. Philosophy divides generally into three main disciplines, which we might think of as differentiated from one another on the basis of the kinds of questions that they ask. The three main disciplines here, as you can see, are metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. The different kinds of questions have to do basically with questions of, so metaphysics asks questions about reality, about the nature of things, about what exists and what doesn't exist. Epistemology asks about knowledge, what we can know, what can be known, what's impossible to know, how do we know things. And axiology is the study of value or value theory, incorporating both aesthetics, which is the study of things that are beautiful and disgusting, and those kinds of concepts of taste, and ethics, the kinds of values that, what matters in life, what's right and what's wrong, what actions are good and what actions are bad. To begin, we're going to be thinking, at least right now, about metaphysics. And so what questions that metaphysics asks are things like, what is the nature of a thing? What is a thing really, right? What is a thing, right? What is a person? What is a economy? What is a country? What is, are things also really as they seem, right? So when we go out and interact with objects out in the world, right? Like you pick up an apple off of the table, is it really there? Is there something outside of our minds that exists that our minds interact with? Or is there just this sort of, veil of experience, and really the way that things seem outside is somehow projection of our minds onto reality of the world? So do we find reality as it is, or do we construct it in some way, shape, or form? Those are kinds of questions that metaphysicians will ask. Now, it seems like at least obvious, at least hopefully it should seem obvious to you, it's less obvious to philosophers, that there are things like tables and chairs and people and animals, houses, atoms, oceans. But what about, things like money or an economy or a number, right? What are those kinds of things, right? Like money isn't just special paper, right? You can take special paper and take it to the bank, and they will take it from you and add to your account. But it's not like they somehow store that money in like a special box that's got your name on it, right? No, it's just now your account has more money in it. But what exactly does that mean? What is money to begin with? Like, what kind of a thing even is it? Is an interesting question. They keep an electronic record of how much money you have, but it's not the physical thing anymore that we're keeping track of. It's just some collection of numbers. What about species? Like, surely there are species, right? There's kinds of animals that are out there, like tigers and elephants and platypuses and pufferfish. But what exactly is a species, right? It's not like a group of animals. Like you could have like a collection of animals, right? Like animal 1, animal 2, animal 3, animal 4, even if they're of the same kind. That's not the species itself, right? The species is this other thing. It's this thing that's over and above the group of animals. It's the thing that this group of animals share. And it couldn't also just be like, the specific DNA pattern. You might be thinking like, oh, that's what the species is, just that DNA pattern that all those animals share. That might be a good attempt at an answer, but it can't be the DNA pattern, because each of those animals has cells, and each of those cells has the same DNA pattern. But the cell from the hair follicle of a dog that has the DNA pattern, the same DNA pattern as the dog, that cell isn't a dog, right? It's a cell. So what exactly is going on here? What could the species even be? What is it to be? What kinds of things are species? These are the kinds of questions that metaphysics tries to answer, right? Metaphysics tries to offer up, lists and explanations of the kinds of things that exist and the relationships that things stand into one another, right? So we talk about animals as being parts of a species, or among a group within a species. Metaphysics gives attempts at categorizing and listing out these hierarchies of relationships. It's interesting then to question like whether or not some of these hierarchies, or whether or not some of these relationships actually exist in nature, right, are sort of part of the structure of the universe itself apart from human beings, or whether or not human beings are integral to the creation of these hierarchies, these ways of thinking about the world, these ways of carving up how the world is organized. And that's a deep sort of and major point in metaphysical thinking as well, whether or not human beings are carving nature at the joints, right? Finding the joints in nature and then being like, oh, this makes a good distinction here and this makes a good distinction here. Or whether or not our, attempt to conceptualize the actual world around us creates these artificial categories. Now, you might be skeptical at this point whether or not it's possible to really even know any of these things, like what exactly is going on when we're doing metaphysics. Like, how could we possibly know how nature is constructed, or whether or not reality is one way over another? Metaphysics seems really difficult. Like, it's like we're not God. I didn't create these things, so how could I possibly know? Well, anyone that's being sort of skeptical or agnostic along these lines basically is already doing a certain kind of philosophy. And that kind of philosophy is called epistemology. So moving from metaphysics onto our second branch of philosophy, metaphysics is difficult and deep, and there's lots of very, very tough questions. And one of the things that often comes up in a discussion of metaphysics is, how the hell do we even know these things, right? It's really hard to see how we could know, and knowledge itself is a kind of tricky concept to begin with. It's not entirely clear what it is to know something. So sometimes people say that they do know things, and it's super obvious in a way that they don't really. Or they'll say like that they knew something was going to happen before it did, and we would agree, no, they really didn't, right? So what's epistemology all about? Take, for example, so here's just a set of distinctions, take this example. Imagine someone places a bet that the LA Lakers are going to beat the Golden State Warriors by 3 points before a basketball game. And the game ends and the Lakers win by 3. Great. The person that made the bet might say, I knew it. I knew I was going to win. I knew that they were going to win by 3. Well, what do you think? Did they actually know that the Lakers were going to win by 3? Did they have some kind of special access to the future that allowed them to take advantage of the betting system? I mean, surely not, right? We might think like, if it's always possible, I guess, that somebody somehow knows the future or paid off the Golden State Warriors to lose by 3. But they didn't, in a normal case, right, where none of that is going on, they didn't know. They didn't really know, right? The person took a shot in the dark and hoped that their bet would win. But they didn't have any really good reason for thinking that their bet would win, did they? Having like a good reason for something that you believe is what it's called in epistemology to be justified or warranted in holding to your belief. Someone is justified in their belief when they have good reasons for believing what they do, and those reasons outweigh any bad reasons or any reasons contrary for believing something. So in this case, right, the bet maker has just as much reason, in fact, probably more reason, to think that their bet will not win rather than will win, right? Because the odds against her bet winning are even more, right, than her bet losing. She might have had a better belief, right, a more justified belief that her belief would fail, right, or that her bet would fail, that the bet would not win. And then, because the Lakers might win by more or less than 3 points, or they might lose altogether. And that seems like there's more possibilities there than them winning by 3 points. However, if our bettor had believed that the bet would be a loser, right? So say she takes out the bet, the Lakers going to win by 3, but she's like, you know what, that's really implausible. I'm just making the bet just in case because I really want, the possibility, and it pays out better if she takes this implausible bet, difficult bet. And so she knows it's probably gonna not win. They're probably not going to win by 3, and so she's justified in this case. She has a good reason for believing that the bet will be a loser. However, suppose in this case the bet doesn't lose. Suppose the bet wins. And, it goes through, right? The Lakers do win by 3. She had the belief that they weren't going to win by 3. It was justified because it was unlikely that they were going to win by 3. Well, in this case, does she know that they're not going to win by 3? Of course not, right? Why not? Because they didn't. They won by 3. And so in this case, you can't know something that's false. In this case, and what's going on here is, when it comes to knowing something, you have to believe things that turn out to be true. And truth is another requirement besides just justification for knowledge. So we end up with having a couple of different sort of general possibilities here, right? When it comes to thinking about epistemology. If, in the 2 scenarios, if the bet wins and the bet maker believed it would win, but they had no good reason for believing that it would win, then they don't have a case of knowledge. Similarly, if the bet wins, however, the bet maker believed it wouldn't win, and they did have a good reason for doing so, this is also not a case of knowledge. In the first case, the person doesn't know because they don't have a good reason. In the second case, they don't know because the situation counted against them and the facts were contrary to what they believed. So what in the end then counts as knowing? Well, at the very least, we have a few requirements now on what it is to know something at all, right? Believe, you have to believe or commit yourself to the truth of what it is that you're thinking about. Justification or warrant, you need something along the lines of a good reason for believing what you believe. And that belief must be true. It must be correct. It must match with the facts. And only in that case could you possibly actually count as really knowing something. Another thing studied by epistemology is the way which we come to know things. So knowledge itself is one kind of thing that epistemologists study, but how we come to know things is even maybe bigger topic. So surely we come to know things often using very basic, we come to know very basic things about our environments using our senses, using our 5 basic senses. And so you can see the colors, like you see the colors of these floating balls. And you can judge, like the distances between yourself and certain objects, like your computer screen right now. But there are some things that we seem to know that don't rely on experience, right? So one tricky thing here, at the very least, is these balls before you. They're actually all the same color. This is an optical illusion. But there are things that we come to know that we don't even have experience of. These things that we know sort of prior to experience are forms of what philosophers like to call a priori knowledge. So a priori knowledge, prior knowledge. And these things include special kinds of truths, like mathematical truths, maybe certain hierarchical relationships, certain general logical relationships. So for example, you can know that if something is a cat, then it's got to be a mammal, right? Given that you understand what a cat is, you understand kind of what the word cat means, or you have the concept of a cat, and it's related in a sense to your concept of being a mammal. You know that if something is going to be a cat, then it has to be a mammal. You might similarly know that if something is a bachelor, if someone is a bachelor, then they must be an unmarried man, right? You had to learn these concepts at some point. And you learn the concepts using experience. But in order to know things that are sort of more general here, once you've got the concepts mastered, you can know these things without having to go out and check in the world, right? It's not like you have to go out into the world and like check all the cats to find out whether, make sure they're all mammals. Like every single cat out there, you're going and you're like, oh, is it warm-blooded? Great. Does it carry its fetuses in its womb? Yeah. Doesn't lay eggs, right? Like it uses milk or something for weaning, those kinds of things. No, like you don't need to go check every single cat in the world to know that if something is a cat, then it's got to be a mammal. once you know these kinds of basic things, a host of other knowledge comes with it, right? And that's the idea here, is that there's all this what we call prior knowledge that kind of comes not necessarily for free, but it floats around in the background, and we come to know it through means that don't involve experiencing parts of the world or going out and doing experiments. Things like math are a perfect example here, right? You know that 2 + 2 = 4 forever and always in every case, but you don't have to go and make sure that it's still true, right? You don't have to keep looking at things and being like, oh, there's 2 things there, there's 2 things there, oh, we got 4 things. These general facts sort of are built into the structure of the universe in some way, shape, or form. And in order to verify their truth, we don't have to go out and do anything. We can simply think, in a sense, from the armchair about these things and come to know their correctness. On the other hand, there is a whole another kind of knowledge that epistemology studies, which is the opposite of a priori knowledge. It's a posteriori knowledge. A posteriori knowledge is the kind of knowledge that comes after one has done some investigating, posterior to the experimentation, to the use of our senses. So this kind of knowledge is the kind that's more central to classical empirical sciences. And these are the 2 kinds of knowledge that epistemologists are interested in, right? The kind of knowledge that you can only have by going out into the world and experiencing things, right? You need to, how do you know what color your neighbor's door is, right? You have to go over there and check. You have to see it with your own eyes. You can't just think really deeply about it and come to find out. But how do you find out whether or not what 5 × 8 is? Somebody told you back in the day, right? But nowadays you can just think it, right? You can determine what it is without having any experience out in the world. You can just calculate. It's a form of a priori knowledge. Interesting examples of this are, lots of different mathematical examples. So for example, the Pythagorean theorem. How do we know that the Pythagorean theorem is true? It's not like we go out and test all the triangles, right? Measuring their A and their B to see if, when squared, they sum to the square of C. We know the Pythagorean theorem is true for all right triangles, not because we've tested it over and over and over again, but in a sense because we discovered that this is a truth of geometry. Pythagoras thought a lot about geometry and determined that this is true. He used, a different kind of method. There's, in a sense, a kind of proof that shows that this is true. And it's by using this, what we might think of as intellectual intuition, we can come sometimes to believe certain kinds of things, a priori truths. Now, intuitions are very important to philosophy, but they're very different from your feelings, and they're not related to what you kind of hold close or hope is true, right? So, for example, one thing I would say is if you're religious, your belief in God is not an intellectual intuition. You don't come to, you don't think really hard and come to see, God exists, or God doesn't exist. Those kinds of beliefs, or faith-based beliefs, are not the same thing as intellectual intuitions. Intellectual intuitions are the kinds of intellectual seemings of how things seem to you when you've thought them through, how it comes to sort of seem once you've thought things all the way out, what seems true, what seems false, not on the basis of what feels true to you, but what actually seems logically to follow from what it is that you believe. We will be using and testing and probing our intuitions throughout this entire class. And by doing that, we'll be calling into question lots of opinions and beliefs that you actually may have. In fact, much of what we're going to be doing is taking intuitions into account and trying to sort of see where they conflict with one another to try and understand what kind of philosophical theories are better or worse. Intuitions themselves are very important for determining whether particular philosophical views have any merit. This is because often views will basically lead to a certain kind of like thought experiment. And then when we use that thought experiment, we can sort of try and determine whether or not our intuitions align with or count as counterexamples to the view that we're thinking about at the time. For example, right, so there's the final subfield of philosophy that we're going to be looking at just, in the class and discussing right now is axiology or value theory, which deals with questions of what we should do and what things are of value, right? So axiology is divided into ethics and aesthetics, where ethics studies questions of morality, how we should act and what kinds of lives are the best lives to lead. Whereas aesthetics studies things like what we find beautiful and what we find displeasing and why. We're not going to be discussing much in the philosophy of aesthetics in this class, not enough time, sadly, but the core of value theory is in a sense the same for both. There are certain things that seem valuable, like beauty and goodness in a sort of objective sense, but then there are also senses in which things are subjective and individually based in different cases. Now, to our example and to our attempt to think using our intuitions, the study of ethics is wrought with questions and situations where we have to probe our intuitions and use them sort of in order to try and determine what's right and what's wrong in particular cases. So here's a classic example. Imagine there's like a special, so we've got two cases. Imagine there's a special train bridge. It's like, and it goes off and there's a bunch of workers that are fixing it. And there's this sort of small handcart trolley that's like coming down the tracks and it's full of tools and parts, but the trolley itself is out of control, right? You see it coming down and you're standing just off to the side, off of the tracks, and you're standing near a lever. And you see that, the trolley is going out of control straight down the tracks and it's gonna hit 5 unsuspecting workers. And if it hits them, they will surely die because it'll either like crush them or it'll knock them off this large bridge thing and they'll fall to their deaths. But you're standing next to this lever and you realize that if you pull the lever, it will divert the trolley off to a side track. But the problem is there's one person that's working on the side track. So the question then is, what should you do? Should you pull the lever and divert the trolley? What do your intellectual intuitions, ethical intuitions actually tell you? What's the right thing to do? In this case, there's 5 people at risk of dying, and you can change the path of the trolley so that only one person will die. But you have to pull the lever. You have to get involved. You have to do something that's ultimately going to cause one person to die, where if you do nothing, you'll let 5 people die. What's the right thing to do? A lot of people think that we should pull the lever, thereby diverting the trolley and killing one person in a sense, right? Like you actively did something that then led to this person's death. However, you saved 5 people. You saved 5 people. And so, maybe in this case, sacrificing only one life is a terrible tragedy, but it's a less terrible tragedy than the 5 other people die. This seems right in a sad and difficult way. But it seems like it's following like why it seems right. It seems like it's the decision to pull the lever is following a certain kind of ethical principle or reasoned idea that you are basing, and maybe you're basing your ethical intuition off of this idea. And the idea here is that it's better. It's always better. It's always more ethically good to save more lives if it's within your power, right? And so in this case, 5 versus 1, it seems like you should try and save the 5. But does that principle really seem like a good moral principle? Can we call that principle into question? What sort of ethical and philosophical merits does the principle, it's always better to save more lives, actually have? Well, we can take this other example. So imagine a very similar situation, except instead of the offshoot and you being next to a lever, there's a walkway over the tracks. And you're near someone that's sort of serious girth. Now you see the trolley coming hurtling down the tracks, and you realize that if you push this other large person at just the right time, you're going to send them flying into the trolley, and you're going to knock the trolley right off the tracks. And it's going to take, the person's going to take the brunt of the force of the trolley. It's going to, kill them, crush them, harm them, but it's going to knock the trolley off the tracks, and it's thereby going to save the 5 people further down the line that would thereby otherwise be in danger. Now, the question then is, and what you should be asking yourself while on top of this bridge with another person, should you push this person of serious girth next to you in order to save the 5 people on the tracks? More often than not, people's intuitions in this case have invariably switched. They deny that it's morally permissible or right to push the large person, sending them into their death, in order to save the 5 workers. Now, if your intuitions match with this, the way that most people usually do, then you might now think sort of, what gives? What is the point here for the example? Like, clearly you might think, in the one case, it's okay to pull the lever, but in the other case, it's just not okay to push the large man. In a sense, I would agree with you. But here the question then becomes, well, what explains this difference between the cases? What moral issue makes a difference in both cases? You'd be sacrificing one person to save 5. Supposedly, you might think that, in the one case, the person would be morally doing the wrong thing if they didn't pull the lever to save the 5. But why not in the case of pushing the large person? What's the moral difference between the cases? What's the difference in our intuitions? What makes the difference justified in our intuitions? We're going to end up returning to this case further on in the course when we discuss this kind of issue in ethics. I just want to mention it here as an example of the kind of thought experiment that we're going to be addressing, where our intuitions are used to probe moral principles and try and push us in our thinking. Now, this sort of thinking also uses some made-up examples in order to test general principles, and it's common practice in philosophy to do so. So just one word of advice is try to not be put off or off-put by any outlandish use of these examples, right? A lot of these examples are kind of far-fetched in certain ways, but usually they're crafted in specific ways in order for philosophers to get you to think about specific issues, showcasing very specific situations so that we can get at the underlying general truths and actually see whether or not those general truths hold and whether or not they have, counterexamples or, whether or not there are good reasons to think that they're actually false or incorrect or need to be augmented in some way, changed in some way to get the ethical situation just right. We'll now turn to, in the sort of second week of the course, starting next week, we'll be discussing ethics specifically. And over the next few weeks, we'll be talking about questions about whether or not, or like what we should be doing in various situations, what makes certain actions right and wrong. And we'll eventually learn about a number of ethical theories and the ways that those different ethical theories try to answer questions like, what is it for an action to be right or wrong? What is it that makes an action morally worthy of praise? And even what is it for a person to be a good person? What is it for a person to live a good life? First, though, we're going to be looking at a specific kind of difficult ethical case study. This is one that is still rather prevalent in our culture. I don't know if you've been following up on the current state of the Supreme Court, But the issue here is the morality of abortion. Now, this is a really difficult topic, but it's a good starting point for thinking about ethics, because people have strong opinions about the morality in the situation, or at the very least about the legality of the situation. I hope that you all have at least thought a little bit about this issue. However, often individuals that have, opinions about this issue often haven't spent enough time critically assessing their own views about this issue, because it's rather difficult, and not a lot of people like chatting about it. So we're going to try and actually discuss that first in this class in order to kind of call the different views that people have into question. One thing that I just want to sort of bring up here at the end of this is that, when it comes to thinking about whether or not you should study philosophy, or why study philosophy, or whether or not it's worthwhile to take this class, I just want to say one thing. Philosophy is difficult. It's hard to actually use philosophy to come to find, underlying answers to very difficult questions. But what it is really good for is determining whether or not the beliefs that you hold, especially the ones relating to these difficult underlying questions, are really justified or not, whether or not you actually have good reasons for believing the things that you believe. And in trying to assess our justifications for these underlying beliefs that we all have, you come to sort of learn how, and improve on your thinking skills in ways that allow you to think more seriously and think more critically about what it is that you believe and the people around you believe. And this ultimately does, I think, help us get closer to the truth, because it helps us to stay away from believing things that are unjustifiable and outlandish. And so, if in the end, if philosophy gets us closer to the truth, then what more could we ask for, right? All right, this has been a great first lecture. I hope you enjoy it, and see you soon.